Yeah, it's just striking. We hopefully we've come a long way from that. That's just such a striking thing that we think about associating that with another human being.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important to tell this story at this time too. We're kind of at a point where if a couple of female basketball players get into a tiff, it becomes sort of a racial divide in this nation, and we really need to kind of reclaim and remember these awesome and amazing moments in our history that we've lost sight of. So, when we hear a lot about the negative aspects of America's racial history, and there's a lot that's negative, there's a lot that we should discuss, but we never hear the stories like this of 50,000 people in Milwaukee, black and white, of different parties, different ages, different ethnicities, coming together to make sure that just one man would not be returned to slavery.
Americans are capable of achieving extraordinary things when they have the freedom and opportunity to do so. This is American Potential.
Welcome to the American Potential Podcast. I'm your host, David Fromm. Have you ever heard the name Joshua Glover? If not, you're not alone. Our guest today only knew the name from seeing it on a plaque in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But after finding a book at an estate sale, he discovered that there was more to Joshua's story and that it's connected to the creation of a political party. You see, Joshua Glover was a runaway slave in 1852 who made an over 400-mile daring escape from Missouri to Wisconsin. Unfortunately, because of the Fugitive Slave Act passed in 1850, slave catchers could cross state lines, and that's exactly what happened. They tracked Glover down, captured him, and threw him in jail. But when the local community caught wind of his situation, they didn't stand by. They took action. So how did Joshua's stories end, and what role did it play in the creation of a political party? Let's talk to our guest today, Michael Jahr, who is the writer-producer of the mini-documentary called Liberty at Stake, the Joshua Glover Story. Welcome, Michael. How are you?
I am doing well, David. How are you?
Good. I'm so interested in the story, so I'm very excited to discuss it. I really think it's pretty fascinating. Before we get started, though, tell us a little bit about your career. I mean, my understanding is that you worked at National Geographic and done some other things.
Yeah, I started off way back when as a print journalist, back when those jobs actually paid, and then I did a 10-year stint on Capitol Hill as a press secretary, communications director. I've worked for a couple of state-based public policy free market think tanks, and then about a year or so ago started this documentary venture.
Wow, that's a cool storied story. That's pretty cool.
It is.
So have you made other documentaries before this one about Joshua Glover?
This is my first foray as a documentary producer. I've always been in communications. And so I've produced a lot of short videos, done a lot of storytelling, done a lot of reporting. But this is really kind of my first time stepping out into filmmaking. And so didn't know exactly what I didn't know, as is always the case when you're starting a new endeavor. And so I assembled a good crew and began to do research and did some fundraising. And we got this project underway at the beginning of 2024. Part of our goal was to be able to tell this story, at least in short, during the Republican National Convention. And it'll make sense as I tell more of the story why that's the case. But we had 50,000 people coming to Milwaukee, and Milwaukee was really at the heart of what the events that took place in 1854. So it just seemed like a great time to be able to share that story, and we were able to do that.
That makes a lot of sense. I happened to be there for the final night and found it quite thrilling. I didn't see this story, but I'm super, I had a great time. Milwaukee was a wonderful place for that convention.
It was amazing. So much energy, and it was a great event.
Yeah, it really was. That's great. So tell me about the plaque that you saw that shared, and I believe kind of helped you understand some of Joshua Glover's story.
So there's a little plaque on the corner of a park in downtown Milwaukee. It's now called Cathedral Square. It used to be known as Courthouse Square. And just on the corner, where nobody really pays much attention to it, is a very brief plaque, a historical marker, that basically says at this point, in this location, a fugitive slave named Joshua Glover was rescued by the people of Milwaukee And I've always thought, well, that's a cool story. That's intriguing. But like you said, it really wasn't until I discovered the book at an estate sale, The Rescue of Joshua Glover, and it's A Fugitive Slave, the Constitution, and the Coming of the Civil War. It's not my book, so I'm not promoting it, but I realized, oh my gosh, there's much more to this story than just a community rallying around a fugitive slave to make sure that he wouldn't go back to a lifetime of bondage. It was more like a catalyst for events that would follow, pretty significant events that would actually alter American history. And I was just shocked that so few people know this story.
It's the first I've heard of it. I had a history minor, a political science major, and really kind of love history. I live just south of you down in the Chicago area. I didn't know it.
Yeah.
So maybe go into some depth if you could and just tell us Glover's story.
So Joshua Glover is a slave in the St. Louis area in 1852. He's working on a 300-acre farm and decides that he's going to escape. And so we don't know a whole lot of details. We assume at night he probably slipped across the river into Illinois and began his 400-mile trek to the north. Some say that he was maybe originally intending to go to Canada. But for whatever reason, he ended up in Racine, Wisconsin, which was an ardent abolitionist community. And there he was welcomed. He was given a job at a sawmill, provided with a small place to live, and for 2 years reveled in freedom for the first time in his life. But his former slave owner, a man named Benamy Garland, never stopped looking for Joshua Glover. So he had hired slave catchers and had a $200 bounty, and eventually the slave catchers tracked him down. So Benamy Garland leaves St. Louis, comes up to Milwaukee, gets a warrant for Joshua Glover's arrest, and puts together a posse, which included 2 U.S. deputy marshals. They go down to Racine at night and knock on Joshua Glover's door. When the door is open, they rush in and beat him up and throw him in a wagon and cart him back up to Milwaukee, put him in a jail cell, and he is bound back to, a lifetime of slavery. Must have been, and so he's bleeding from his head wounds, and he's contemplating the fact that, his life, his freedom is over. But the abolitionist community in Racine got wind of this, and they had a big rally the following morning. They put a notice in the local newspaper, huge rally at the square in Racine, Wisconsin. But they also sent a telegram up to a abolitionist newspaper editor named Sherman Booth up in Milwaukee. And they said, "We believe that a man has been abducted here and probably taken to the jail up there. Will you go check that out?" So Sherman Booth goes to the jail. Originally, or at least initially, the officials were kind of trying to downplay it and imply that no, nothing to see here. But eventually he determines that, yes, Joshua Glover has been arrested and is in the jail cell. He goes out, gets on his horse, and rides around Milwaukee through the streets like Paul Revere, calling people to turn out on behalf of Joshua Glover and to come to the courthouse at 2 p.m.
I think one of the things that I wasn't totally connected to, like I said, I feel like kind of a student of history, is that I'd kind of assumed that when you got into the North as a slave, you were kind of free. But it's not the case. I mean, the slave owners could come and hire people and come and even enlist the government to come and recapture you and put you back into slavery. That's kind of awful.
It was, and things had been moving in the right direction. So the Constitution basically allowed for escaped slaves to be, reclaimed by their owners. But a lot of northern states had not only abolished slavery, around the time of our founding, but they also began to put in law protections for fugitive slaves. So due process and all that sorts of things that basically made it very difficult and more expensive for slave owners to come up and reclaim their lost goods in their eyes. So that was going on, and Southerners were becoming increasingly frustrated until 1850. And in the Compromise of 1850, kind of the major law that was supposed to make the issues of slavery go away, they passed the Fugitive Slave Act. And that put much stronger teeth in the ability of slave owners to reclaim their former slaves. So for 4 years, that had been in effect. And basically, the people of the North were increasingly angry about the fact that not only were these, their states, free states, were all of a sudden being drawn into the slavery process. And they're like, well, in 1848, Wisconsin was established as a free state. But if people can just come up here and grab black people off the streets and take them to slavery without any due process, without any human or civil rights, then we're not a free state by definition. We're, so it kind of came to a head in 1854 in different ways, and the arrest and rescue of Joshua Glover were right at the heart of it.
So this crowd assembles at 2:00 at the jail or at the courthouse, and so what happens then?
And it's not just any crowd. 5,000 people showed up
Wow.
on a cold March day.
I wonder how many people lived in Milwaukee at the time.
About 20,000 people lived in Milwaukee at the time. And the people of Racine, too, they were so outraged in Racine that they put 100 people on a ship in the Racine harbor, and they sent them up to Milwaukee to join the protests. So 100 people, again, on a very cold March day in 1854, dropped whatever they were doing on behalf of a man that most of them had never met to make sure that he did not get returned to a lifetime of slavery. So and originally it was a very orderly gathering. They established committees, they passed resolutions, they delivered speeches in English and in German. It is Milwaukee after all. And eventually they, came to the conclusion that nothing's going to happen here. The officials are not going to release this man. So they switched tactics, and they went over to a cathedral that was being constructed at the time right across the street. And they grabbed a wooden beam and they carried it back across to the courthouse. And they used that beam to batter down the courthouse door. And then the crowd rushed in, overwhelmed the guards, broke Joshua Glover out of his jail cell, brought him out and put him on a carriage that was waiting for him. And then they whisked him away to basically what is now Waukesha, Wisconsin, which at the time was a very wooded, kind of hidden area. And they basically hid him in the Underground Railroad for 3 or 4 weeks in people's homes and barns and attics while the feds tried to track him down until they were able to find a ship. Ship captain said, I'll take him and hide him in my cargo. And he took Joshua Glover through the Great Lakes and took him to Ontario, Canada, where Joshua Glover was able to find a home in the Toronto area and, a place to live and work. And he lived the remainder of his life, about 40 years, in the Toronto area.
That's a pretty thrilling story. I can't believe I haven't known that. God bless the people of Wisconsin back then. That's fabulous. Well, so how did this lead to the creation of a political party?
So on March 10th, Glover was rescued from the Milwaukee jail. On March 11th, he was rescued from the jail. On March 20th, a group of abolitionists up in Racine, Ripon, Wisconsin, just about an hour away, at least today, gathered at a little white schoolhouse. It was a collection of abolitionists.
I've been to it. I've been to it.
Have you? Okay.
Yeah.
Met at the schoolhouse there, and they said, we need a new anti-slavery political party in this country. The group was made up of Whigs and Democrats and some Free Soil Party members, but they said, this is not working. We need an anti-slavery party. And they didn't agree on much else. They were all over in terms of other issues. The one thing that united them was their opposition to slavery, the Fugitive Slave Act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was in the process of being passed by Congress. And so they came out of that event calling themselves Republicans. And it's the first time in American history where a group called themselves Republicans based on a party that would be opposed to the extension of slavery. And a few months later, there were big events in Jackson, Michigan, and in Madison, Wisconsin, where they had actually kind of more official conventions. But that very first gathering took place in Ripon, and we know that the very first Republican president who was elected was Abraham Lincoln. And his election led to Southern secession, Civil War, 4 years of internal battles, and then eventually emancipation. So the Joshua Glover event was not the only thing that led to all of that, but it certainly was a catalyst. Right. Kind of lit the fuse, if you will.
Yeah, almost. It certainly was a catalyst. Almost was an embodiment of maybe what people were upset about in the country, at least in part of the country. So
absolutely, it really was a national debate, and the outrage against the activities of the South was growing, and the opposition to slavery. Just 2 years earlier, Uncle Tom's Cabin had come out. I've read that they had 7 or 8 printing presses going around the clock, day and night, and they could not keep up with the demand for that book, which, told the story of basically the atrocities of slavery. Most people in the North, you think about America in the 1850s, people were just working their farms or they were running their shops. They didn't have much exposure to the world beyond their community. There wasn't mass communications. And so Uncle Tom's Cabin really opened people's eyes to the heinous activities and the brutality of slavery. And that really energized the abolitionist movement at that time.
Well, so you said that you were working to get this done for the Republican National Convention there in Milwaukee. How was it received? Like, what was the reaction? Did you get any feedback from being able to show it there?
Yeah, it was great. It's the feedback that I often get. First of all, people are like, how have we never heard this story? I've been a lifelong Republican. I've been a delegate. I've been blah, 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 and just shocked that they've never heard this story. So we had a chance to show it on the first day of the convention at the historic Miller High Life Theater, where President Teddy Roosevelt spoke, and just it's just a beautiful historic theater. And we were able to show it because it's only a 12-minute mini documentary. We were able to show it several times throughout the afternoon, and Senator Ron Johnson came by and some others. We had a panel discussion and so on. So it was fantastic. And then we had a booth set up alongside the Little White Schoolhouse in the Convention Fest. And so we get a chance to talk to media and delegates and families from even law enforcement people, because we had law enforcement from all over the country. And we just got to share this story over and over and over again. And it was great. We have handouts and material, and people would take huge stacks of our stuff and say, I'm taking this back to my church and I'm going to share it with everybody, or, whatever. And so the 2 guys stopped by from the Hawaii delegation. I told them the story. They said, can we have 89 of your handouts? And I said, that's a really odd and specific number. Why 89? And they said, there are 89 of us in our delegation, and we're going to give one to every member of our delegation. So it was just very well received. And that was an impetus for us to continue on the full-length documentary. So we are in the process of producing what we hope to be a 60 to 90-minute documentary that we can, pitch to Netflix and Prime and PBS and so on, and really get this story out there nationally.
I think it's wonderful. I mean, I think that you hit the nail on the head. I had the same reaction of like, I can't believe I don't know the story. It's so so inspiring and kind of obviously connected to where the nation went and the major changes that occurred. So obviously making a mini documentary has to be kind of challenging, because there's probably a lot of stuff you couldn't include if you're going to make a 60 to 90 minute one. How'd you go through that process? And are there any things that, didn't make it into the mini documentary that you're excited about for the larger documentary?
Yeah. So we really only had about 6 months to put that together, and we had to raise money. We had to start from scratch. We didn't have a website. We didn't even have a name.
Wow.
So we put that together very quickly, but like you say, there's a lot that we could not do in that time frame and with the resources that we had. So since then, we've had a chance to interview Dr. Robert Baker, who is the author of the book that kind of got this all started. We're going to be up in Ripon in a little over a week. We're going to be talking to a professor emeritus from Ripon College, who's going to talk about some of the details of what happened at the Little White Schoolhouse on that day and what led up to that. We would like to travel to St. Louis. We'd like to travel to Toronto and kind of cover Glover's story from start to finish. He was purchased by Ben Garland on the courthouse steps on New Year's Day, 1850. So that courthouse and those courthouse steps are still there. So we want to be able to film things like that. There's a park in Toronto that's dedicated to the memory of Joshua Glover. So we'll probably talk to people who have expertise on the Underground Railroad and just be able to kind of fill in some gaps and things that we just weren't able to do in the shorter version.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing that. It is kind of striking, to say the least, that, when you just said, like, it was purchased on the courthouse steps. It's like, oh, man, that's, St. Louis isn't that far from me. And I live in Illinois, and it's right over the border, right over past the river there. And it's just striking. We hopefully we've come a long way from that. That's just such a striking thing that we think about associating that with another human being.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important to tell this story at this time too. We're kind of at a point where if a couple of female basketball players get into a tiff, it becomes sort of a racial divide in this nation, and we really need to kind of reclaim and remember these awesome and amazing moments in our history that we've lost sight of. So, when we hear a lot about the negative aspects of America's racial history, and there's a lot that's negative. There's a lot that we should discuss, but we never hear the stories like this of 50,000 people in Milwaukee, black and white, of different parties, different ages, different ethnicities, coming together to make sure that just one man would not be returned to slavery. And one part of the story that we haven't touched on either is the fact that some of the rescuers were arrested under the Fugitive Slave Act, including Sherman Booth, that newspaper editor. They were arrested and they were sued by the owner, and so successfully sued. So he lost his printing presses and his business. They were in and out of jail under the Fugitive Slave Act. They had basically violated federal law. So the interesting thing is that the state or the federal courts would throw them in jail basically, and the state courts would then release them. And this kind of went back and forth until basically the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin ruled that the Fugitive Slave Act was unconstitutional and would not be enforced in this state. And they made a very credible case for why they really genuinely felt that it was a violation of the U.S. Constitution to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. So we were the only state, Wisconsin was the only state in the nation to basically say, we're not going to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act here. It's null and void.
That's something Wisconsinites can be proud of. That's pretty cool.
Absolutely.
I'm excited. Even though I'm in Illinois and we talk trash about Wisconsin and vice versa.
Exactly.
I'm pretty proud of our neighbors to the north for that.
I'm a Michigan native, and I've discovered that the Wisconsin-Illinois relationship is much like the Michigan-Ohio relationship. There's a lot of animosity there, a lot of deeply embedded hostility between those two states, and I've picked that up here in Wisconsin as well.
Yeah. I would say Ohio, Michigan might be a little more intense, mostly around football rivalry.
Yeah, exactly.
I just think this story's so cool because we're doing something here at Americans for Prosperity and here on the American Potential podcast, where we're talking about like one small step. Think the small actions or initial steps that people have taken that have led to greater freedom and liberty, or them getting involved and making a huge difference in their community. Like, and we look back throughout history and there's so many people that took a step and it didn't seem that significant at the time, but it really changed the course of history in some cases. Mm-hmm. And, this seems like that to me in a number of different ways. Joshua Glover going and, really escaping for his freedom. I mean, obviously it's a huge risk and an admirable, really a courageous move. But then the people who, accepted him in their community, the people who fought for him by going to the courthouse, the editor got on his horse and went around and rallied people to the cause. And then folks coming up for Racine and others. I just think that, it's a lot of people taking actions for good. And, that helped change the course of history and really expanded a lot of freedom and opportunity for, tens of millions of people in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. You think even too about the people in the Underground Railroad who took a great risk, just keeping them in their house. Because all you need is for like your child to say, "Mommy, why is there a man in our attic?" And mention that, out in some public setting, and you're going to jail. So there are so many unsung heroes that are part of this story, but it begins with Joshua Glover taking that initial step I was reading recently into the autobiography of Frederick Douglass and the incredible fear he had before he took the step to escape, knowing what the consequences would be if he didn't get away. So it was a huge step, but it just shows that heart that human beings have, that desire for freedom, that desire for liberty, and how powerful that is, that you would literally risk your life in order to, in the pursuit of that. So, it's just inspiring on so many fronts.
Well, Michael, I really appreciate you telling this story, and I look forward to seeing it in an expanded version. And I really do hope it really catches fire, because I think it's such a cool story that I didn't know. And I think that a lot of people will really benefit from it and really enjoy it. So thanks for joining us.
David, thank you for having me on the show. And I should add that this really is not a partisan story either. We have the involvement of the mayor of Milwaukee, who is a longtime Democrat. And it's been a very, I've shared this all over the place. And it's just been, it's an American story. It's not a Republican story or Democrat story or this or that. It really is just a profound American story, and one that I think really should unite and bring people together at a time when we're so polarized. So if people want to check out more, our website is lasfilm.com. So that's Liberty at Stake, lasfilm.com. We are a nonprofit entity, and we are raising money to finish the full-length documentary. So if you would go to our site, there is a button you can click on. We have a Give Butter donation site, and all of the donations will be tax exempt. So we've had donations as small as $10 and as large as $50,000. And we love you all. Come check out you can watch the mini documentary on our site, and you can learn more about the full-length story that we're trying to tell here. So David, thanks for having me on.
I hope folks go to the website, Michael. I think that's fabulous. Folks, go visit that website. If you feel led to donate, please do that, and pay attention. Tell your friends about the story too. That's fabulous. And also stop and read those plaques that people put down. Yeah, exactly. You never know what you're going to find. It's a great story of a little curiosity and learning, and then a little more curiosity on Michael's part to go figure out what happened there. And now we can tell an even greater story about the path to freedom in America. So
absolutely.
If you like this episode and would like to stay connected with the podcast, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel, as well as following us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And always remember, liberty and freedom are easily taken for granted. Don't take for granted. Go out there and defend liberty and freedom. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to American Potential. You may listen to more stories from Americans working every day to expand freedom and opportunity in their communities by visiting AmericanPotential.com.